Thank you all very much. My name's Catherine Barrett and I coordinate a program promoting the sexual health of older people at Gay and Lesbian Health Victoria and the Australian Research Centre in Sex Health and Society at La Trobe University. But today I'm here to tell you about a big fat idea I had in 2009, which was around creating a network supporting people providing services to older lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex Australians. So I'm going to refer to that group of people as LGBTI from here. And that big fat idea resulted in the establishment of Val's Cafe, which is a network for aged care service providers. And I have one of my colleagues, Kaz White, here today, who now coordinates Val's Cafe. We have 180 aged care service providers that are members of that organisation. And one of the things that particularly happens at Val's Cafe is a focus on LGBTI inclusive aged care services. And there's been a real focus, some of you may have noticed, there's been a real focus in the media in the last 12 months on the needs of older LGBTI people, and particularly on the need to provide LGBTI inclusive aged care services. Some of you may have seen this document, which is the National Strategy for LGBTI Ageing and Aged Care, which explicitly refers to the need for LGBTI inclusive aged care services. And some of you may also be aware that the Aged Care Act changed last year to recognise older LGBTI people as a special needs group. So there's been a really significant focus in the last 12 months on older LGBTI people, which is fantastic, and requests for information to Val's Cafe have just gone through the roof, which is absolutely fantastic. And as I said before, a particular focus of the work that we're doing is around assisting services to develop systems that are inclusive of LGBTI people. But not everybody is convinced. There are some people out there who think that in their service they can't actually see any older LGBTI people, and so they don't understand why they need to, and they don't understand, why is this a group of people who are any different from, Italians or Greeks, and shouldn't we be just treating everybody the same? And so what I want to do for the next 10 minutes is really highlight that there are some differences, some really significant differences, and they provide an imperative or help people to understand why LGBTI inclusive aged care services are so important. And to understand those, what I want to do is take you back to the 1960s, because an older person now who's receiving aged care services was probably coming of age or in their late teens or early 20s in the 1960s. And I want you to imagine for a minute what it would have been like to have been a young gay man or a young gay woman questioning your sexuality in the 1960s. And some of you may already know that in the 1960s, you could be locked up for being gay. You could be sent to a psychiatrist and be forced to have shock therapy to cure you of your homosexuality. You could lose your family and your friends. You could lose your job. So it was a really challenging time. And I want you to imagine what that would have been like. And to help you imagine what it would have been like, I want to show you an extract from the Encyclopedia of Sexual Behaviour from the 1960s, from 1962 actually. It was written by a couple of medical practitioners, and there's a chapter in that encyclopedia on perversions. And there's a section in that chapter on perversions on homosexuality. And I want to read that to you. And as I read it to you, I want you to imagine that you're a teenage kid questioning your sexuality at a time when this was the prevailing view. And I'm going to ask you what that would have felt like. Okay, so to start with, the encyclopedia looks at the causes of homosexuality, because you've got to remember in the 1960s, homosexuality was considered to be an illness. So the encyclopedia reads, in the complete absence of a father, or perhaps in the presence of a weak father, or perhaps an alcoholic father who spews forth hatred against the mother, the boy child suppresses his feeling toward all women. So that's the encyclopedia's take on the causes of homosexuality. And the social implications, they suggest that homosexuality may be associated with other perversions, such as exhibitionism, sadism, neurosis, insanity, or alcoholism. Homosexuality is socially important because it may involve or lead to other offences, such as blackmail and occasionally murder. So this is from 1962, written by a couple of medical practitioners. If you were a teenage boy reading these, or a teenage girl, what do you think that would feel like to read that, if that was the prevailing view at the time in the 1960s? Would anyone like to? Scary. You'd feel scared? Yeah, fantastic, thank you. Do you think you'd tell your parents? Like if that was the prevailing view, do you think you'd tell your parents if you thought you were gay?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, okay. What about for other people?
Lonely.
You'd feel lonely? Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. So in fact, these responses, feeling scared or feeling lonely, are really quite have been quite commonly articulated by older LGBTI people. A couple of years back, I worked on a project called My People, which involved interviewing older LGBTI people about their experiences growing up in the 50s and 60s. And these are some of the things that they shared with me, that they were scared and so they didn't tell their parents, or they didn't tell their workplace, or that they felt lonely. These are some of the things that they experienced, and that shaped the way that they responded. And I want to show you a couple of extracts from that My People report with an older gay man and an older lesbian talking about what it was like for them. So the first one from My People was James, who was a 64-year-old gay man who was living in residential aged care. And he said that I ended up in a psychiatric ward. I was in and out for months and I didn't know why I was attracted to men. So I had to go to a psychiatrist. He told me that he thought I was gay. They gave me shock treatment because I was stressed out and panicking and I didn't know what I was. They reckoned homosexuality was a sickness, but I don't believe it's a sickness. Because you love someone the same sex doesn't mean it's a sickness. So that was his experience of living through those values and attitudes in the 1960s. And when I met James, he was in a residential aged care facility, and some of the other residents used to rile him up and call him a poof. And he would respond in such an aggressive way to that. He would yell back at them and it would be on for all in the facility. And he said that that was his way of responding because he'd had such discriminatory experiences that he felt that he couldn't sit with them in his body, that he had to yell back. And that was the way that he responded. But some of the other people I met didn't respond in those really overt ways and put people back in their places. And one of them in particular in this study was Elizabeth, who was a 79-year-old lesbian. And she talked about taking on, if you like, some of the values and attitudes at the time. And this is what Elizabeth said. At the time, she thought that being a lesbian was an anathema. That's the problem we've got now, we older people. It's still there. We've internalised it. Part of you believes that you are an anathema. It affects your self-esteem and things like that. It makes your self-esteem lower. It certainly doesn't increase it unless you're a robot. And when I met Elizabeth, she was living at home and, in one of the outer suburbs of Melbourne. And she talked about living behind enemy lines. And that was her experience of living in a suburb that was predominantly heterosexual. She didn't know any other LGBTI people in her suburb. And she spent a lot of time and energy protecting her sexuality so that nobody knew that she was a lesbian. And that was her experience. She felt that she had to hide the fact that she was a lesbian to be safe in the suburb that she lived in. And in a moment, we're going to look at her experience of aged care because it's really quite interesting as well. So you could imagine that with these historical experiences of discrimination that older LGBTI people have faced, that it has an impact on their mental health. And there haven't been any large studies conducted in Australia on older LGBTI people, but there is really quite a large one that's been conducted in the UK, and I want to show you that one. The Stonewall Report, the researchers surveyed over 1,000 heterosexual people and over 1,000 lesbian, gay and bisexual people. And comparing the two groups of people, they identified that older lesbian, gay and bi people had more often had a history of mental ill health, were more likely to have depression and anxiety, and were more likely to take alcohol and drugs, and were less likely to access health services that they needed. And the reason for the last one was because this group of people were anticipating discrimination in aged care services, so they were less likely to access services that they needed. So there has been no equivalent in terms of a large study comparing older LGBTI people and heterosexuals in Australia, but what we've found with my people and some of the work we're doing at the moment with Beyond Blue is that there are patterns around mental ill health, and that has an effect on how people present themselves in aged care services. And what I would like to show you in the next 3 slides is some examples of how older LGBT people have responded in aged care services. And so to start with, we come back to Elizabeth, who's the 79-year-old lesbian that we heard from earlier. And Elizabeth went to a number of group sessions. So she lived at home and went to a number of group sessions. And she says, I go to a group once a week. It's a very huggy group. Everyone else gives someone else a hug. I thought to myself last week, crumbs, if they knew I was gay, and immediately, what happens to the hugs? The hugs are important because you need touch, contact with other people. I don't know what happens if you don't get it. I mean, you get it from the cat. It would change if they knew you were gay. I have 4 group sessions a week and 2 book clubs a month, and in none of those sessions I feel I can be who I am. So one of the things that Elizabeth has taken from her historical experiences is that she feels that there's a lot of discrimination in society still, and so she didn't disclose that she was a lesbian to the service providers. And I bet that the people that were coordinating these groups probably thought she was a straight woman, and so did the other people that were in the group with her. And so I think this is an issue for aged care service providers in particular, who often think that they don't have any GLBTI clients. But in fact, you know, you could argue that if Elizabeth felt that she was in a safe environment, then she may have disclosed. And the next person is Tom, who was a 64-year-old man, gay man, living in residential aged care. And Tom said, I can't talk to the staff about being gay because I'm worried that my care will be worse. I'm not able to live a gay man's life here because there's no privacy, there are rules, and some people think that gay is disgusting. I keep my mouth shut. I have to be careful how I act, and I have to be careful what I say. So Tom's experience in residential aged care was a really profound one. He felt that he had to, hang up his stirrups as a gay man. He felt that he had to really just let go of the fact that he was a gay man in residential aged care. And really quite a different experience from Elizabeth, who had to, arguably hide her sexuality in activity groups, for that period that she was in activity groups. But for Tom, this was the rest of his life. The way he lived his life, he felt that he couldn't be a gay man. So the effect of a service that wasn't LGBTI inclusive on Tom was really quite profound. And the final one that I want to share with you is Nancy's story. Nancy was a 79-year-old transsexual woman, and she transitioned in the 1960s, and she'd been able to have breast augmentation, but she hadn't been able to have genital surgery. So she had a penis and she had breasts. And when I met her, she was in a residential service, and the people that were in that service, everybody knew that she was trans. I mean, she'd tell people, but she was also physically unable to hide the fact that she was trans. And I met Maggie, who was one of her carers and had been caring for Nancy for 15 years. And Maggie's response to Nancy was wonderful, and I think really highlights the power that aged care service providers have to help LGBTI people live their lives. And I want to read to you what Maggie said about caring for Nancy. Nancy dressed very inappropriately when I first met her. The staff used to think it was funny when she walked out in a bikini with half her genitals falling out of the bottom of her bikini pants. They thought it was funny to watch her get around like that. When I took over the place, I helped Nancy to feminise herself. We were teaching her how to be feminine, and she blossomed. She is a woman. That's how I've always treated her. I think Maggie's response is so powerful because she's just really met, completely person-centred care. She's just said, whoever Nancy says she is, that's the person that I'm responding to. So there were no judgments. And Maggie had never met a trans person before, but she was just completely responding to where Nancy was coming from. And I think that really highlights the power of LGBTI inclusive aged care services to really provide environments for older LGBTI people that really enhance their health and well-being. So I hope that what I've done over these last 10 minutes has helped you to understand that this is a group of people who've had the most extraordinary experiences of discrimination and really have earned the right to have to access services that are inclusive, not because they have had historical experiences of discrimination, but because they are older people who deserve the right to be respected and valued for who they are. And what I want to do is finish by looking at the work that we're doing in Val's Cafe. This is a copy, this slide shows you our website that's been set up by Kaz White, and the person whose face is on our website is one of our patrons, Noel Tovey, who's a 79-year-old Indigenous gay man. And Noel was incarcerated at the age of 18 for being gay, and he served a number of months in Pentridge Prison and has quite an extraordinary story to tell. But you can see from the website some of the other work we do. We provide education sessions. We've got a number of resources to provide structure for aged care services to understand how to deliver an inclusive service for older LGBTI people. And as I said before, we now have almost 180 aged care services that have signed up to our newsletter and have become members of Val's Cafe. And before I finish, I think the final note I'd like to finish on is a tribute to Val Eastwood. Val Eastwood set up Val's Coffee Lounge in the 1950s in Melbourne at a time where you could be rounded up and put in prison for being gay or lesbian or trans. And Val Eastwood, in total defiance, set up Val's Coffee Lounge and really encouraged GLBTI people to come to the Coffee Lounge. And there are lots of stories of LGBTI Melburnians going to Val's Cafe and saying, "Oh my God, I thought I was the only one in the world." And Val created this incredible place of hospitality. We set up Val's Cafe in her honour because a couple of years ago we were aware that Val was receiving aged care services, and we want to, the work is really honouring her memory and saying that this is a group of people who deserve to have Val's hospitality replicated in aged care services. So thank you all very much.